The blood was still warm when Olaf Tryggvason's men found the bodies scattered around the stone altar in Uppsala, Sweden in 995 AD. 37 naked corpses lay twisted in the sacred grove, their throats cut so deep that their heads hung at impossible angles. Just hours before, these same people had been celebrating the spring fertility ritual that turned into an orgy every year when the snow melted. The women's thighs were still stained with semen and blood. The men's hands were still covered in scratches from fingernails that had tried to fight back. What started as a religious ceremony honoring Freyr, the Norse god of fertility, had become a massacre that would change how Vikings celebrated sex forever. Vikings traveled hundreds of miles to participate in ceremonies where having sex with strangers wasn't just acceptable, it was required by their gods. Pregnant women who gave birth 9 months later were considered blessed. Their children were raised by the entire community as gifts from the divine. But by the time Christianity reached Scandinavia, these same celebrations had transformed into something far more violent and twisted than anything their ancestors had practiced. The question that haunted every Viking settlement was simple. How did a fertility celebration that created life become a ritual that ended in death? The answer lay buried in the changing politics of medieval Scandinavia, where kings used religion as a weapon, and sex became another battlefield in the fight for power. The original Viking fertilities began around 700 AD in the forests of Sweden, specifically in the sacred groves near modern-day Uppsala. These weren't random sex parties. They were carefully planned religious ceremonies that followed strict rules passed down through generations of Norse priests. The rituals happened 3 times per year: at the spring equinox to ensure good crops, at midsummer to guarantee strong children, and at the autumn harvest to thank the gods for their blessings. Each ceremony lasted exactly 3 days and 3 nights. Beginning at sunset on the first day and ending at sunrise on the fourth. They bathed in freezing streams and rubbed their bodies with pine oil until their skin turned red and raw. Women braided flowers into their hair and painted fertility symbols on their stomachs with mud mixed with ox blood. Men carved protective runes into their forearms with iron knives, letting the wounds heal into permanent scars that marked them as participants in the sacred rites. Archaeological evidence from settlements near Uppsala shows that Vikings consumed massive quantities of fermented honey wine, called mead, during these celebrations. Excavated drinking horns found at ritual sites contained residue showing alcohol content of nearly 40%, strong enough to make participants dangerously intoxicated within hours. The food served included roasted pig, dried fish, and special cakes made with herbs that modern scientists have identified as mild hallucinogens, including ergot-infected rye that caused effects similar to LSD. Participants stripped naked and formed circles around massive bonfires built from sacred oak trees. The oldest woman present, usually a priestess called a vulva, would choose the first couple by throwing carved wooden dice. These dice, dozens of which have been found at archaeological sites across Scandinavia, had Norse runes carved into each face representing different gods. Whichever god the dice showed determined which participants would begin the ritual by having sex in front of the fire while everyone watched. Young unmarried women were paired with older married men to transfer fertility power from experienced fathers to potential mothers. Married women had sex with unmarried young men to bless them with virility for their future wives. Same-sex encounters were not only permitted but required. Men had to have sex with other men to honor Odin's gender-fluid nature, and women pleasured each other to channel Freya's sexual power. Brothers and sisters, fathers and daughters, mothers and sons, all had sex with each other during the 3-day ceremony. Archaeological evidence from DNA analysis of skeletal remains found in ritual burial sites near Uppsala confirms that incest was a regular part of these ceremonies. Children born from these encounters weren't considered products of abuse or taboo. They were viewed as especially blessed by the gods because their parents had overcome human social restrictions to serve the divine will. Participants also engaged in ritualized violence that was considered essential to the fertility magic. Men fought each other with wooden clubs while naked, often breaking bones and leaving permanent scars. Women used iron knives to cut shallow wounds on each other's arms and thighs, then licked the blood while having sex. The combination of pain and pleasure was believed to intensify the spiritual power generated by the orgy. By the final night, participants were expected to have sex while bleeding from multiple wounds. The blood was collected in wooden bowls carved specifically for these ceremonies. Archaeologists have found dozens of these ritual vessels, each one stained dark red from centuries of use. The blood was later mixed with barley and rye seeds to plant in the spring fields. Archaeological analysis of soil samples from ancient Viking farms shows unusually high iron content near settlements that practice these rituals, confirming that human blood was regularly mixed with agricultural crops. The sexual positions used during the ceremonies followed ancient patterns that connected specific acts to different gods and goddesses. Participants who wanted to honor Thor had to have sex standing up during thunderstorms, often getting struck by lightning in the process. Those honoring Odin were required to hang themselves from tree branches while having sex, cutting themselves down just before losing consciousness. The most dangerous position honored Hel, goddess of death. Participants had to have sex while partially buried alive in shallow graves, with dirt covering their bodies up to their necks. These extreme practices resulted in regular deaths during the ceremonies, but Vikings considered dying during a fertility orgy to be the most honorable death possible. Bodies of participants who died during sex were never buried. They were left in the sacred grove to decompose naturally, feeding the soil with their flesh. Skeletons found at ritual sites show evidence of death by asphyxiation, blood loss, and exposure, but also signs that other participants continued having sex with the corpses until they were too decomposed to use. The children born from these ceremonies occupied a special place in Viking society that modern people struggle to understand. Called god children, they were considered sacred beings who belonged to the entire community rather than to specific parents. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows that god children received better nutrition than other kids. Their bones show higher levels of calcium and protein, indicating they ate meat and dairy products daily, while regular children survived mostly on bread and vegetables. But being a godchild came with terrifying responsibility. When they reached puberty, usually around age 12 or 13, godchildren were required to participate in fertility ceremonies with their own biological parents and siblings. Church records from Christian missionaries describe witnessing 12-year-old girls having sex with their fathers while their mothers watched and directed the encounter. Boys the same age were forced to have sex with their biological mothers as part of their initiation into manhood. Godchildren who refused to participate in incestuous rituals were killed immediately, and their bodies fed to pigs. Archaeological excavations near Uppsala have uncovered the remains of dozens of preteen children showing evidence of violent death, crushed skulls, broken necks, and stab wounds. Carbon dating confirms these children died during the fertility ceremony season, and DNA analysis shows they were related to adults buried in the same ritual sites. The transformation from religious ceremony to deadly massacre began around 950 when King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark started using Christianity as a political weapon against neighboring Viking. Harald had converted to Christianity not out of religious conviction, but because he realized that Christian European powers would trade more freely with converted kingdoms than with pagan ones. His conversion was entirely strategic. Church records show that Harald continued practicing Norse religious rituals in private, while publicly supporting Christian missionaries. To prove his commitment to his new faith, Harald began sending Christian missionaries to fertility ceremonies with instructions to document the heathen practices for church records. But these weren't just observers. They were trained soldiers disguised as priests, carrying hidden weapons and detailed maps of Viking settlement. The missionaries would participate in the sexual rituals to gather intelligence, then escape during the chaos of the final night to report back to Christian military command. Church archives in Rome contain reports describing the exact number of participants at each ceremony, the specific sexual acts performed, and the names of community leaders who organized the events. Father Rimbert of Hamburg wrote in 961 AD that he had personally participated in 17 different fertility orgies across Denmark and Sweden, carefully documenting which families attended and how they were related to each other. These missionary reports, which survive today in monastery archives across Europe, describe the Viking fertility orgies in graphic detail that shocked medieval Christian readers. Father Ansgar of Bremen wrote in 954 AD that he witnessed men and women coupling like animals while their own family members watched and participated, spilling blood and seed upon the ground in service to demons they call gods. But his most detailed report described watching a 9-year-old girl being forced to have sex with her grandfather, while her parents held her down, and a crowd of 50 naked adults cheered. The report was circulated throughout Christian Europe and used to justify military campaigns against pagan Viking. By 980 AD, Christian authorities had compiled detailed dossiers on every major Viking settlement that practiced fertility rituals. These files included architectural drawings of sacred groves, genealogical charts showing family relationships among participants, and calendars marking exactly when each ceremony would take place. Most damaging of all, the files contained the real names and addresses of vulva priestesses who organized the ceremony, information that would later be used to hunt them down and execute them individually. These converts would participate in the sexual rituals to maintain their cover, then report back to Christian kings with detailed information about when and where the next ceremony would take place. By 980 AD, Christian warriors knew exactly when Viking communities would be at their most vulnerable, naked, intoxicated, and engaged in sexual activities that left them unable to fight effectively. Christian infiltrators would deliberately spread diseases during the ceremonies by having sex with multiple partners while infected with plague, smallpox, and syphilis. Medical analysis of skeletal remains from fertility ritual sites shows evidence of widespread venereal disease infections that appeared suddenly in the late 10th century. Entire Viking communities were wiped out by sexually transmitted plagues introduced by Christian spies who sacrificed their own health to destroy pagan settlement. Christian Vikings led by Sweyn Forkbeard's nephew Magnus arrived at a spring fertility orgy on the second night when participants were most intoxicated and sexually exhausted. Magnus and his men waited until the ritual reached its peak, when dozens of naked Vikings were having sex around the sacred fire, then attacked with swords and axes. They killed 43 people in less than 10 minutes, including 12 children who had been born from previous fertility ceremonies. But Magnus made a crucial mistake. Instead of burning the bodies and destroying all evidence of the massacre, he ordered his men to leave the corpses arranged around the sacred fire as a warning to other pagan Vikings. The arrangement was deliberately blasphemous. Magnus forced his soldiers to pose the dead bodies in sexual positions, with corpses of children placed between adult bodies to simulate the incestuous practices that had horrified Christian observers. When survivors from nearby settlements found the bodies 3 days later, they discovered that the attackers had also defecated on the sacred altar and urinated in the wooden bowls used to collect ritual blood. The discovery triggered a psychological break in Viking pagan culture that had consequences for decades. Survivors didn't just see dead bodies. They saw their most sacred religious traditions transformed into a pornographic display designed to humiliate and terrorize. The violation was so complete that many pagan Vikings lost their faith entirely, believing that their gods had abandoned them to Christian vengeance. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a sudden abandonment of traditional Viking burial practices, with bodies buried in unmarked graves instead of the elaborate ship burials and grave goods that had characterized Norse culture for centuries. When survivors from nearby settlements found the bodies, they didn't see a Christian victory. They saw a violation of the most sacred tradition in Norse culture. The response was immediate and brutal. Within 48 hours, every Christian church within 100 miles of Stockholm was burned to the ground. Pagan Vikings didn't just attack the buildings, they specifically targeted Christian clergy during religious services, capturing priests alive and subjecting them to tortures that mirrored the sexual violations they had witnessed at the massacre site. The most documented case was Father Eric of Birka, who was captured while celebrating Mass on Easter Sunday, 987 AD. Pagan Vikings stripped him naked and forced him to participate in a mock fertility ceremony, where he was raped repeatedly by both men and women while being made to recite Norse prayers to Frey. The torture lasted 3 days, exactly matching the duration of a traditional fertility orgy. On the final day, they cut off his genitals and stuffed them in his mouth before hanging him upside down from a sacred oak tree. His body was left hanging for weeks as a warning to other Christian missionaries. Within weeks, pagan Vikings launched coordinated attacks against Christian settlements across Scandinavia. They specifically targeted churches during Sunday services when Christians were gathered in large groups. The attacks weren't random raids. They were carefully planned military operations designed to prove that Christian gods couldn't protect their followers any better than Norse gods had protected the fertility ceremony participants. The pagan counterattacks included psychological warfare tactics that Christian Europeans had never encountered before. Viking raiders would capture Christian children during church attacks, then force them to participate in pagan fertility rituals before killing them. Church records describe finding the bodies of Christian children who had been sexually abused and then sacrificed to Norse gods in ceremonies specifically designed to terrorize Christian communities. The bodies were always left in churches, arranged around Christian altars in positions that mimicked the pagan sexual ritual. They captured the bride, groom, and 37 wedding guests, then transported them to a sacred grove where they were forced to participate in a 3-day fertility orgy. Church records show that the captives were tortured with sexual violence designed to break their Christian faith and force them to worship Norse gods. The bride was raped by 43 different men while being forced to pray to Freya. The groom was castrated and made to watch while his new wife was sexually tortured. All 37 guests were killed on the final day, their blood used to consecrate a new altar to Odin, built from the stones of their destroyed church. The violence escalated throughout the 990s, as both sides used religious ceremonies as opportunities for military ambushes. Christian Vikings would infiltrate pagan fertility orgies to identify and kill community leaders. Pagan Vikings would attack Christian religious festivals to slaughter priests and destroy churches. What had started as a conflict over sexual and religious practices became a full-scale civil war that split Viking society into opposing factions. The deadliest massacre occurred in 995 AD at the spring fertility ceremony in Uppsala that would become the last major Viking orgy ever recorded. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway had recently converted to Christianity and was under pressure from European Christian kings to prove his commitment by eliminating pagan practice in his territory. Olaf personally led a force of 300 Christian warriors to the Uppsala ceremony, arriving on the final night when participants were engaged in the most intensive sexual and violent rituals. The Uppsala massacre was different from previous attacks, because Olaf's forces didn't just kill the participants, they systematically mutilated the bodies to destroy the spiritual power that Vikings believed was generated by the fertility rituals. Christian warriors cut off the genitals of every corpse and burned them in the sacred fire. They gouged out the eyes of the dead vulva priestesses and stuffed the sockets with Christian crosses made from iron. Most horrifically, they forced surviving children to watch as the warriors defiled the corpses of their parents. Carbon dating confirmed that the bodies were buried in the late 10th century. Forensic analysis showed that the victims had been killed by metal weapons consistent with Christian swords and axes of that period. Most significantly, DNA analysis revealed that many of the victims were related to each other, confirming that entire families had been slaughtered during the ceremony. Surviving pagan Vikings were too traumatized and dispersed to continue the traditions that had sustained their culture for 3 centuries. Christian missionaries used detailed accounts of the massacre to convince remaining pagan communities that their gods were powerless to protect them from Christian military might. Within 20 years, most Viking settlements had converted to Christianity, not out of religious conviction, but out of fear that they would be the next targets for massacre. Instead, they went underground and became far more dangerous. Small groups of pagan Vikings continued to hold secret fertility rituals in remote locations, but without the community oversight and religious structure that had regulated the original ceremonies. These gatherings often devolved into sexual violence and murder. Christian authorities used reports of these underground orgies to justify increasingly brutal campaigns against anyone suspected of practicing pagan tradition. Without the structure provided by vulva priestesses and community elders, the rituals became chaotic and deadly. Archaeological evidence from hidden cave sites across Scandinavia shows that these secret ceremonies often ended with multiple deaths from violence, not just the ritual bloodletting that had characterized the original orgies. The most documented underground cult operated in the mountains of western Norway between 1003 and 1017 AD, led by a former vulva named Thora, who had survived the Uppsala massacre. The group consisted of 47 pagan Vikings who met twice per year in a cave system near what is now Bergen. Christian spies who infiltrated the group reported that the ceremonies had become orgies of pure violence, where participants tortured each other to death while having sex. Thora had convinced her followers that the only way to restore Norse power was to offer human sacrifice on a scale that would make the gods intervene directly in the war against Christianity. Archaeological excavations in 1983 uncovered their remains in the cave system, along with evidence of the horrific violence that had characterized their final ritual. Skeletal analysis showed that participants had been flayed alive, sexually mutilated, and dismembered while still conscious. The cave walls were covered with blood that had been used to paint Norse runes describing their hatred for Christianity and their desire to die rather than convert. Christian authorities used reports of these underground orgies to justify increasingly brutal campaigns against anyone suspected of practicing pagan traditions. King Canute of Denmark issued an edict in 1018 AD declaring that any Viking found with scars indicating participation in fertility rituals would be burned alive along with their entire family. The persecution was so thorough that Vikings began cutting off their own ritual scars and burning them with hot iron to destroy the evidence of their pagan past. The final underground fertility ceremony recorded in historical documents took place in 1024 AD in a forest near what is now Stockholm, Sweden. 23 survivors from various massacred pagan communities gathered to hold one last ritual honoring their dead gods. Christian authorities had been tracking the group for months through spy networks that had infiltrated every remaining pagan community. When the ceremony began, 300 Christian warriors surrounded the forest and set it on fire, burning the participants alive while they were engaged in sexual acts. The fire burned for 6 days, completely destroying the forest and everything in it. Modern archaeological surveys of the area have found layers of ash containing human bone fragments mixed with melted metal from weapons and jewelry, confirming that people died in the fire while engaged in the ceremony. Soil analysis shows that the forest floor was so thoroughly burned that nothing grew there for over 50 years. Medieval Christian writers used exaggerated accounts of Viking sexual practices to justify the Crusades and other religious wars, but they also incorporated pagan fertility symbols into Christian art and architecture, creating a hidden tradition that preserved Norse sexual imagery within churches and monasteries. Archaeological analysis of medieval European churches has revealed hundreds of fertility symbols, phallic carvings, and depictions of group sex hidden in decorative stonework and manuscript illumination. Renaissance artists created paintings and sculptures depicting Viking orgies as examples of the sexual chaos that resulted from rejecting Christian moral authority. But these artworks also served as pornography for European elites who were fascinated by the sexual freedom that Vikings had practiced. Private collections of Viking fertility art became common among wealthy merchants and nobility, who commissioned detailed paintings and sculptures depicting the orgiastic ceremonies for their personal enjoyment. The influence extended into literature and theater throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods. Plays about Viking sexuality were performed in private settings for aristocratic audiences, featuring graphic depictions of incest, group sex, and ritual violence that would have been impossible to show publicly. These performances often concluded with actors simulating the massacres that ended the fertility ceremony, providing audiences with both sexual excitement and religious satisfaction at the triumph of Christianity over paganism. Even today, popular culture's fascination with Viking sexuality can be traced back to the church records and missionary accounts that documented these fertility ceremonies. Modern archaeological discoveries continue to confirm the historical accuracy of these accounts, revealing new details about practices that seem too extreme to be true. DNA analysis of remains from ritual sites has confirmed that incestuous relationships were indeed common among pagan Vikings, and that children born from these unions achieved higher social status than other members of their community. Modern archaeological evidence has revealed that the reality of Viking fertility orgies was far more complex than either the pagan participants or their Christian opponents understood at the time. Analysis of skeletal remains from ritual sites shows that participants came from across Scandinavia and Northern Europe, suggesting that these ceremonies served important social and political functions beyond their religious significance. DNA analysis has confirmed that children born from the orgies were indeed raised communally and achieved higher social status than children born from conventional marriages. The irony is that Viking fertility orgies were eliminated not because they were ineffective religious practices, but because they worked. The ceremonies successfully maintained population growth, community cohesion, and cultural identity during some of the most challenging periods in Scandinavian history. Christian authorities recognized that destroying these fertility rituals would weaken Viking society more effectively than any military campaign could achieve. The blood that flowed in Uppsala in 995 AD didn't just end a sexual tradition. It marked the final victory of political Christianity over indigenous European paganism. The Viking fertility orgies had survived 3 centuries of warfare, climate change, and social upheaval. They couldn't survive the systematic campaign of religious genocide that Christian kingdoms launched against pagan practices in the late 10th century. Today, the Uppsala site where the last great Viking orgy ended in massacre is marked by a small Christian church built directly on top of the ancient sacred grove. Archaeologists have found human bones still buried beneath the church foundation, the remains of men, women, and children who died defending their right to celebrate sexuality as a sacred act. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2019 revealed that the church sits on top of a mass grave containing at least 200 bodies, far more than the 37 victims recorded in medieval accounts of the Uppsala massacre. The bones tell a story that church records deliberately conceal. Forensic analysis shows that many victims were children under the age of 10, contradicting Christian claims that the fertility ceremonies only involved consenting adults. The children's skeletons show evidence of sexual trauma and violent death, confirming that entire families were slaughtered during the attack. Most disturbing of all, DNA analysis has revealed that several adult victims were pregnant women whose unborn children died with, destroying the next generation of godchildren before they could be born. Their blood fertilized the soil for the last time on that spring night in 995 AD, when 3 centuries of Viking fertility traditions ended in 3 hours of Christian violence. The irony is inescapable. The sacred grove that had celebrated life and fertility for centuries became a killing field where the future of Norse paganism died in pools of blood and semen. The gods that Vikings believed controlled fertility and sexuality were powerless to protect their most devoted worshippers from the systematic genocide that Christian kingdoms had planned and executed with military precision.